Thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem.
I appreciate that.
Please be seated.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Good afternoon, Dr. Proctor.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. My name is Bethany Schneider. As you know, we've met several times.
Yes.
And you know, I represent R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company.
Yes.
A different tobacco company than Mr. Stern represents, right?
That's right.
So I'm going to be asking you some questions today, and some will be specifically regarding R.J. Reynolds, and others will be general, okay?
Sounds good.
And as you discussed with both Mr. Page and Mr. Stern, you've been involved in many depositions and many trials, right?
That's right.
You are very familiar with angle cases like this one.
Yes.
And as you understand, at the end of the trial, the jury will have to fill out a verdict form with questions about Mrs. Ledoux.
I assume that part of the trial I don't pay much attention to.
Okay, but you're familiar with the concept of a verdict form.
Sort of. I've never actually read one.
Okay. You've been involved in a lot of these cases, but you never looked at the verdict form.
No, that's not really my part of the trial.
All right. And as you told Mr. Stern, when it comes to Mrs. Ledoux and questions about what Mrs. Ledoux knew, when she knew it, and what she did with any information that she acquired about the dangers of smoking, that's not something you're here to talk about, right?
I'm sorry. Objection hasn't answered.
I'm going to overrule, but we have heard this, but go ahead and answer.
That's right.
Okay.
Let's move on.
And because of that, because we know you're not here to talk about Mrs. Ledoux, I'm going to focus the rest of my questions on general topics, which hopefully will make Mr. Page happy. Okay?
I don't think he's going to be happy.
No, all right.
I'm happy.
No questions.
My friends say that.
Okay. So I want to pick up with one of the things that you talked about with Mr. Page and Mr. Stern, which was advertisements, okay?
Yes.
And you showed the jury a number of television advertisements for various brands, Philip Morris, Winston, things like that.
That's right.
You showed them advertisements that had to do with sports figures, celebrities, also things like that.
Yes.
And I think that Mr. Stern made this point, but just to be clear, even those types of advertisements were legal.
Yes, I don't know the law it broke.
Okay. Now, you also showed the Flintstones and Beverly Hillbillies,
Yes.
and advertising on those shows was legal as well,
I
right?
believe so.
So let's talk about the Flintstones. Winston sponsored the Flintstones. I think you actually said this, you were very forthcoming on direct, only for a single season during 1960, right?
Yes, that's right.
And although you don't know any specifics about Mrs. Ledoux, if she was born in 1941, that would have made her 19 years old at the time.
I have no reason to dispute that.
Okay. And that was actually the very first year the Flintstones were on TV, right?
That's right.
And when the Flintstones first came out, you actually told the jury that it was an adult cartoon.
It was. That's how it was advertised.
It was advertised as an adult comedy.
Yes, it was a prime time cartoon that was advertised as an adult cartoon.
And when you say prime time, I believe that the Flintstones was actually on at 8:30 p.m. on Friday nights.
That's right.
And it was based on the very popular television show called The Honeymooners.
That's right, with Jackie Gleason and Art Carney.
All right. And some of the jurors may know who that is, others may not.
Most of them, I think, are too young.
Okay.
Yeah, well, maybe, but it still exists in reruns.
Okay. And it was actually 3 or 4 years after Winston stopped advertising on the Flintstones that it was moved to Saturday morning and became what we know as the Flintstones.
That's correct, by which time Winston was no longer responsible.
Now, I think you had a little bit of a disagreement with Mr. Stern at one point in his direct about the warning labels. And when he was asking you whether the warning labels on cigarettes were some of the first warning labels on consumer products, You talked about warnings at railroad crossings and also on poison bottles, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you've also talked about some public service announcements having to do with cigarettes that I believe you showed the jury an example of yesterday.
That's right.
It was the Bill Tallman Don't Be a Loser PSA,
Yes,
right?
from 1968.
Okay, and there's also a PSA about warnings.
Yes.
So I'd like to show that to the jury. AN 947N. If you'll show that.
We receive many warnings in our life, and sometimes they can save our life. This message is brought to you by the American Cancer Society.
Dr. Proctor, do you know what year that PSA was on?
Well, it would have had to be in that 67 to 70 period.
Okay. And that period, the 67 to 70 period, is what you've talked to the jury about that dealt with the fairness doctrine.
Correct.
And I believe you told the jury that the fairness doctrine lasted for about 4 years, I think you said.
That's about right.
But even after the fairness doctrine ended, PSAs did still continue to be on television.
That's right. The stations were no longer required to do it, but in fact they did continue with some.
Okay. And so PSAs ran on television through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s.
That's true.
Now, you talked on direct with Mr. Page a lot about the conspiracy.
Yes.
And you agree that the agreements between the cigarette companies were for a limited purpose,
Yes.
right?
It was not an everything conspiracy.
And Reynolds and Philip Morris have always been separate companies.
Yes, that's true.
You've seen no evidence demonstrating that the cigarette companies entered into any kind of agreement to market filtered cigarettes as a health reassurance product.
Well, that's mostly true. It's also true that there's an overlap in some of the themes used in marketing these products. But it's also true that each separately wanted to capture most of that market.
Okay, and thank you for that. When the jury is thinking about this agreement to conceal, marketing filtered cigarettes is not something that would fall under that.
Well, I'm not sure, because there is a sense there's an overlap in the types of things that were concealed with respect to filters as part of the agreement. So in other words, the agreement was to deny any harm from smoking, and that's one reason no company could say a filter was actually safer, because it would imply the others were not safe. So it did limit the types of claims that could be made in marketing.
And I appreciate that explanation, but to be clear, as you have said before, the companies did not bond together and say, let's make filters, this will fool people.
No, they didn't.
Now, on your direct examination, you indicated at certain times that the tobacco companies knew from the beginning that filters were ineffective.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
And I want to talk to you about what the documents reflect, what R.J. Reynolds scientists thought. That's okay. Too bad it didn't have a good, song that it would play.
I think it's the cuckoo song.
That's okay, no problem. So I want to talk to you then about what the documents reflect R.J. Reynolds scientists thought about filters in the early years, okay?
Yes.
You, as you told the jury, have reviewed a lot of documents.
I have.
In fact, I think you said maybe hundreds of thousands of tobacco documents.
That's right.
In all of those documents, you've never seen an R.J. Reynolds document in which R.J. Reynolds scientists described filters as a, quote, gimmick, right?
I don't recall seeing that word. That's true.
All right. And you've never seen an R.J. Reynolds document in which R.J. Reynolds scientists described filters as a, quote, illusion.
Right, that's from Philip Morris.
Now, you can't identify any documents from the 60s, 70s, or 80s where R.J. Reynolds scientists are stating that they believe smokers of filtered cigarettes are getting just as much tar and nicotine as smokers of non-filtered cigarettes.
Yeah, you've narrowed that, and it's true when I think of the examples, it's more from Brown and Williams, some of the other companies.
Okay, I think we're going to look at an example that you may be thinking of in just a moment. But as far as that question is, that's correct.
I believe so, yeah. I can't think of a counterexample.
All right. Likewise, you've not seen any documents from R.J. Reynolds scientists in the 1970s, 1980s, or 1990s where they state that filters being put on their cigarettes are ineffective.
I don't recall those exact words.
But in all those documents, you have seen some examples of where R.J. Reynolds company scientists expressed that they genuinely believed that filtered cigarettes were better for health.
I probably have seen such, but I can't think of examples. There's so many documents.
Okay, but you have seen some examples of that, right?
Probably, because there's immense diversity in these archives.
And there are also some documents in the files of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company in which R.J. Reynolds scientists genuinely expressed belief that lower tar products were better.
Yeah, I mean, it depends partly on what you mean by lower tar products, because it's actually true that if you're getting lower tar, they would be safer. The problem was that what was described as low tar was not in fact low tar. So to answer that properly, you'd have to distinguish what they were talking about when they said low tar.
Okay, but if I just ask you that there are documents in the files of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company in which their scientists expressed belief that lower tar products were better, you would answer, I think there are some.
There probably are some like that, again, given the ambiguities in the definition of low tar.
So let's talk specifically about Winston cigarettes. Mr. Page told you, I think, in the beginning of his direct, that Winston's were a brand that's at issue in this case.
Right.
So as you said, Winston's were first introduced in 1954,
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
And they were introduced as a filter cigarette.
Yes, from the very beginning.
Winston's has never been available in a non-filter variety.
Correct.
And you showed the jury cigarette advertisements which featured actors portraying doctors, nurses, dentists, and so forth.
Yes, cartoon figures.
Isn't it true, Dr. Proctor, that no advertisement for Winston cigarettes ever referred to the so-called doctors?
Yes, the doctor theme had stopped in 1953 with the conspiracy. I mean, one reason for the conspiracy was to stop the doctor-themed ads because, in fact, they were scaring some people. So the overt reassurance that you got pre-conspiracy becomes less direct, and that's why they dropped the doctors.
Okay, and the same thing then would be true about dentists. There's no Winston advertisements that referred to so-called dentists.
That's right, again, that's part of the conspiracy.
And then the same thing is true for Winston's, which started in 1954. There was no Winston advertisement that referred to so-called nurses.
That's right.
And isn't it true that no advertisement for Winston cigarettes ever made any of the types of health claims that earlier advertisements in the 30s and 40s have made?
That's true in general, but some of the earlier claims like toasting and things like that, the word itself, the word filter itself was a type of claim. I mean, it's similar and different to the earlier reassurance program.
But what I'm talking about here in this question is the types of overt testimonials from doctors and nurses that you had described earlier in time. Once Winston's came out in 1954, those types of advertisements were gone.
No, that's right. That was one whole point of the conspiracy, was to stop making overt reassurance claims.
And actually, I think you discussed with Mr. Stern that starting at that point in time, there were no advertisements that described any cigarette as safe.
Yeah, they didn't use that word. They would use words like, softer words like wholesome and something.
It's very soft. Now, you're aware that there were advertisements in the 1950s for some filter brands which mentioned the words tar and nicotine, or that they were lower in tar and nicotine.
Yes.
But isn't it doctors, nurses, dentists, and so forth?
Yes, cartoon figures.
Isn't it true, Dr. Proctor, that no advertisement for Winston cigarettes ever referred to the so-called doctors?
Yes, the doctor theme had stopped in 1953 with the conspiracy. I mean, one reason for the conspiracy was to stop the doctor-themed ads because, in fact, they were scaring some people. So the overt reassurance that you got pre-conspiracy becomes less direct, and that's why they dropped the doctors.
Okay, and the same thing then would be true about dentists, that there's no Winston advertisements that referred to so-called dentists.
That's right, again, that's part of the conspiracy.
And then the same thing is true for Winston's, which started in 1954. There was no Winston advertisement that referred to so-called nurses.
That's right.
And isn't it true that no advertisement for Winston cigarettes ever made any of the types of health claims that earlier advertisements in the 30s and 40s had made?
That's true in general, but some of the earlier claims like toasting and things like that, the word itself, the word filter itself was a type of claim. I mean, it's similar and different to the earlier reassurance program.
But what I'm talking about here in this question is the types of overt testimonials from doctors and nurses that you had described earlier in time. Once Winston's came out in 1954, those types of advertisements were gone.
No, that's right. That was one whole point of the conspiracy, was to stop making overt reassurance claims.
And actually, I think you discussed with Mr. Stern that starting at that point in time, there were no advertisements that described any cigarette as safe.
Yeah, they didn't use that word. They would use words like, softer words like wholesome and something.
It's very soft. Now, you're aware that there were advertisements in the 1950s for some filter brands which mentioned the words tar and nicotine, or that they were lower in tar and nicotine.
Yes.
But isn't it true that as far as Winston cigarettes, you've not seen any advertisements for Winston cigarettes in the 1950s that talked about tar and nicotine?
I think that's right.
And you've not seen any Winston advertisements that said, you're going to get less tar and nicotine with these cigarettes.
No.
Prior to 1970, you're not aware of any Winston advertisement that ever mentioned the words tar or nicotine in their advertisement or on the pack.
I think that's true. I'd have to check to see whether they listed the numerical values at the bottom. It's possible they did that, but I don't think they included it in the text message.
Okay, but sitting here today, testifying to this jury, you don't recall off the top of your head seeing anything like that.
I don't.
And making it even broader than just Winston, you can't identify any ad for any Reynolds cigarette that contained the word tar or nicotine until those figures were required in advertising in 1970, as you talked about with Mr. Stern.
In any cigarette ad mentioning tar and nicotine? Because I know some mention tar and nicotine.
Well, any ad for any R.J. Reynolds cigarette prior to 1970.
Well, there must be some, but I just don't recall a particular example. That was not uncommon in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
I don't, again, Absolutely.
Right. Again, sitting here testifying to this jury, you can't think of any R.J. Reynolds ad prior to 1970 that used the words tar or nicotine.
Not off the top of my head.
Reader's Digest was something that you discussed with Mr. Stern, and that was, as you said, the most popular magazine in the United States between the 20s and 60s, right?
That's right.
In fact, it had it reached up to 25% of households.
Yes.
And you told Mr. Stern that in the 1950s, the Reader's Digest became pro-filter.
Yes. Yeah, the editor becomes a smoker. They visit the factories of the cigarette makers, and they thought that filters were safer, so they endorsed them.
And that was going to be my next question. They actually, the writers and the owners of Reader's Digest endorsed filtered cigarettes as safer cigarettes.
That's right. They actually believed they were safer, and that's actually one of the reasons for the increased popularity of so-called filters was that Reader's Digest and other medical organizations had endorsed them.
And you guessed my next question again. That was the point I was going to make, is that the increased popularity during the 1950s that you talked about with Mr. Page, one of the reasons for that was the fact that Reader's Digest, the most popular magazine in the country at the time, endorsed them.
That's right, yeah. Following the lead of the companies which were part of it.
Now I want to go to one of the documents you talked about with Mr. Page, the 1953 Teague document. I'm very familiar with that document.
The Survey of Cancer Research.
Yes. And I think you told Mr. Page that Dr. Teague started out as a bench chemist tasked with reviewing the state of the art of the science.
That's right, with regard to whether cigarettes cause cancer.
All right. So let's talk about what Dr. Teague did and what he looked at, okay?
Yes.
And what Dr. Teague essentially did was he went to the medical library at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, did a literature search the same way anyone with comparable scientific experience could have done, right?
That's true. Yeah, I think Reynolds also had its own library. I'm sure he checked that as well.
But he did go to a public library and look at sources there as well.
Yes, he did.
And the bottom line is that all the sources he cited were publicly available sources.
Well, that's a bottom line, yes.
Okay. So let's actually look at the bibliography for that document. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Now, there's a 4-page bibliography containing 78 references
That's right.
to public sources.
Yes.
And you can see that some of the highlighted ones are all ones that are available publicly, as we've been saying.
Yeah, these are all published. In fact, I think everything in the entire list is published.
And so there's nothing here cited to that was secret or based upon tobacco company research.
Generally, I think that's true. These are all publicly available technical terms.
So let's talk about these and the types of evidence that he looked at, okay? He looked at different lines of evidence that could be used to reach the conclusion about the dangers of smoking, right?
He did.
And you talked about this some with Mr. Page and Mr. Stern, so I'll try to go through it more briefly with you. But one of the lines of evidence was human epidemiology studies.
Yes.
And you explained what those were with
I did.
Mr. Stern.
Right.
I think you said that they came from the epidemic.
It's literally the science of epidemics.
So it's the studies of patterns of diseases in populations.
Right.
The second type of study he looked at were animal or experimental studies, such as those mouse skin painting studies.
That's right.
A third major type of study he looked at was chemistry or chemical analytic studies, such as studies of the composition of smoke.
Correct.
Studies of what was in smoke so people could evaluate what was the likely effect of someone being exposed to those chemicals in smoke.
Right, and maybe even more importantly, which ones might you be able to take out to make cigarettes safer?
And you would agree that all of that information was the right type of information that he should have been looking at, right?
It's true.
And I think, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I said it's true.
And I think you've actually described it as a very competent review.
It is. It's a good review of the state of the art.
And you told us that these were referred to as the 3 pillars of the consensus.
That's right.
These lines of evidence, these pillars, were in fact published, presented to the public, to smokers in general, by scientific publications, right?
That's right.
And then they would be reported on in, for instance, the mass media.
Yes.
I think you have mentioned that 1950, there were 5 different kinds of these studies in English language, right?
Just epidemiology, yes.
Thank you for that. And they were epidemiology studies that showed a strong correlation between smoking and lung cancer.
That's right.
Then I think you told Mr. Page that in the early 1950s there are more than a dozen.
Yes.
And as soon as these studies were published in the scientific literature, or very shortly thereafter, they were picked up by the lay media and published in the lay press and received widespread publicity.
Many of them did.
Sources like newspapers and magazines
That's right.
and radio.
Yes.
And you were very forthcoming with us when Mr. Page was asking you questions about these, and you told us that they received a great deal of
Yes,
publicity.
well, I try to be forthcoming.
And you always are. And you agree that publicity about those studies served to increase the awareness of the public about the dangers and, as you were saying, the harms of smoking.
Yes, and not just the awareness, but the knowledge. It's stronger than awareness.
So going back to the Dr. Teague document, Dr. Teague actually cites 14 studies done by a very famous researcher named Dr. Rothko.
Yes, except I wouldn't call him very famous. When I published about his life, I called him the forgotten father of experimental carcinogenesis.
And sometimes you referred to him as the unsung hero.
He's the unsung hero, yeah. He published mainly in Spanish, French, and German, and so was not well known in the Anglo-American world, and so didn't get as much credit as he should have, even though Teague, to his credit, actually cites, I think, 14 or 15 or 16 sources of wrongful.
And Dr. Rothko's work, although originally published in other languages, was picked up by scientific literature that was in English.
Occasionally.
And after it made its way into the scientific literature, it very quickly began to appear in newspapers and magazines and so forth.
Occasionally it did appear, yeah.
And while we're talking about the Teague document, I do want to point out that that document was in the same year as that famous Winder and Graham study that we talked about at length.
That's right, it's about 10 months earlier.
Now, specifically going to those mouse skin pains, and I apologize for jumping around a little bit. I'm trying not to take up too much of your time, but it's your opinion that in 1953, the mouse skin pains were seen and reacted to so broadly by the smoking public that it created what I think you've described as a health crisis in this country.
Yes, it's sometimes, it's sometimes referred to as a scare, a crisis, or even a catastrophe, or the emergency is another term.
All of those very scary words.
Generally, though health scare tended to have the implication of not a real danger, but the other terms were stronger.
Okay. And one more subject before we leave Dr. Teague's 1953 document. I want to talk about the chemistry studies just briefly. That was another line of evidence that Dr. Teague looked at.
Yes, the chemical analytics.
He found studies in the publicly available literature that contained information about the presence of carcinogens in tobacco smoke.
He did.
And I think we've talked about this, but carcinogen means,
Cancer-causing substance.
okay, yes. And in fact, the literature he reviewed from public sources included information about those PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
Okay.
Also about benzopyrene,
Yes.
and the presence of carcinogen in tobacco smoke actually began being reported in scientific literature in the 30s and 40s.
Yes, that's right.
By the 1950s, it was widely reported in the popular press to non-scientists, like in the types of magazines we've been looking at over the past few days, that there were carcinogens in cigarette smoke.
It is reported, yes.
In fact, it gets a lot of attention.
It does get a fair amount of attention.
So I want to talk a little bit about Reynolds' work in that area. Okay?
Yes.
All right. Because Reynolds, as a company, began studying the chemistry of cigarette smoke in the early 1950s, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And you told the jury about a Reynolds scientist named Dr. Rodman.
Yes, Alan Roger.
Dr. Rodman identified compounds in cigarette smoke that were thought to be carcinogenic.
Yes.
And isn't it true that every carcinogen that Dr. Rodman was working at R.J. Reynolds and found in cigarette smoke was either already reported in the peer-reviewed literature or reported soon thereafter?
Yes. Rodman himself gives lectures on this topic.
And you agree that some of the most important ones were discovered by Dr. Rodman.
Yes.
You're not aware, in all those documents that you've looked at, of any internal company documents at R.J. Reynolds in the 1950s that identify compounds in cigarette smoke that weren't either already public or were made public soon thereafter,
I
right?
think that's generally true. Yeah, the list, for example, that was supplied by Philip Morris on behalf of the other companies included those compounds that were discovered by Roger.
And with respect to any other company, you're not aware of any internal company documents in the 1950s that identified different compounds in smoke that were not also publicly known, or at least known within a very short time.
I think that's generally fair.
So continuing with this discussion about Dr. Rodman and the information known and available about carcinogens in tobacco smoke, as you told the jury and discussed with Mr. Stern about Philip Morris, the tobacco companies did give some information to the Surgeon General for the 1964 report.
They did.
Isn't it true that all the compounds that R.J. Reynolds, through the work of Dr. Rodman, identified in cigarette smoke, were disclosed to the Surgeon General's Advisory Committee?
Yeah, that's what I said.
And that, as you did say, included the work of Dr. Rodman.
It did.
Dr. Rodman did not omit the work he had done identifying compounds that were carcinogens in tobacco smoke, did he?
I think that's correct.
In fact, he included some new and previously unknown carcinogens in that list he had discovered.
That's right.
And isn't it true that in the 1964 report, the Surgeon General identified the carcinogens in cigarette smoke in part through the work of Alan Rodman,
That's true.
Dr. Rodman?
Yes.
All right, so we've talked about over the last few days the type of information that was available about the dangers of smoking in the early 1950s. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the effect of that information on the public.
Okay.
The information that came out in the early 1950s was very powerful evidence about the dangers of smoking.
It was.
The publicity around those studies in the early 1950s made a significant portion of the people, I think you described as, fear for their lives.
Yes, it's the first great wave of quitting.
It stimulated quitting in this country, right?
It did.
You told the jury that's actually when you get a significant amount of self-help manuals to help people quit.
Your Honor, sorry, objection has an answer, just that I'm missing the question.
Yes, the first really popular self-help manual is that one by Green that we were looking at. That was published. They originally thought it would sell only a few thousand copies, and it sold eventually millions of copies. So it became quite popular.
Was that the one in the Newsweek article that we were looking at?
From the early 50s.
From 1951, right? So the book that they referred to in that 1951 article actually sold millions of copies to help people smoke.
Eventually,
Quit
yes.
smoking.
Eventually, yes.
And that powerful information from the early 1950s about the dangers of smoking, in your words, scared millions of people into quitting in the early 1950s.
It did. Mainly the mid-50s forward.
And this quitting was driven by people's fears and concerns about the dangers of smoking.
That's true.
And you would agree that the beginning of the large-scale quitting smoking in this country was based on people's fears and concerns about the dangers of smoking.
That's right.
Your Honor, I'm going to set up this thing, so it might be a good time for the afternoon break.
I know, I was kind of wondering if we could push forward a little more.
Okay, that's
How are
fine.
you all feeling? Good? Let's, what do you need to set up? Just the easel?
Just easel.
Yeah,
That's
let's keep going, because I wanted to do the break.
Since she set up mine, I'm gonna set up.
Well, it's teamwork.
It is teamwork, but I'm not getting anything called a laser pointer.
Okay.
Put it up here.
I'm not sure where the best place is to put that. I think it's fine right here for an hour or so. All right. Now, I'm sure you know what's coming.
Actually, I don't. I'm really surprised.
All right. Well, I'm still going to play out of Mr. Furr's playbook, so
Okay.
luckily it's a good playbook.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you about some of the things you talked about with Mr. Stern about quitting, but I want to focus on some more specific items as well, okay?
Okay.
So at the top I'm going to write quitting.
Your handwriting is much neater.
I wasn't going to say that, but all right, I appreciate it. So let's remind ourselves that quitting actually began in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s.
Right, in response to the new evidence and the new publicity of the evidence.
Okay, great. So then, first, can you guys all see this? Okay. So first I'm going to write 1950s here. So you would agree with me, sir, that I could write millions next to it, right? And that means millions of people were quitting during this time.
Right.
Because the information, the powerful information that was coming out about the dangers of smoking were scaring people into quitting.
It's true.
Then I think you told Mr. Stern that by 1964, there were 17 million former smokers.
About that, yeah.
The period of 1960 and 1965 was a period of heavy quitting, right?
Yes.
So between 1960 and 1965, sorry. You would agree that according to the historical, can you still see it? Or, why is your head in the way? Would it be better if I moved up here? Okay. You would agree that during that time period, according to historical record, about 9 million Americans quit smoking.
Something like that.
So if we do the math, and and luckily it's already written down here, because I don't know if I could do that off the top of my head, that about 5,000 smokers a day that equals out to.
Right, something like that.
You talked about the fact that the first label went on the pack in 1966.
Correct.
So after the Surgeon General's report of 1964, which I think you've actually described as the, quote, turning point, and the label in 1966, the quitting in this country accelerated.
It did.
So between 1966 and 1970, there were 13 million smokers who quit in that time frame.
Around that, yes.
Now, if I get too low and you can't see it, just let me know. Okay. And the quitting didn't stop in 1970, did it?
No.
I think you told Mr. Stern that between 1964 and 1979, 30 million smokers quit.
Something like that.
And as you said, by 1975, this is a hard angle, right? 45 million people had to quit.
Altogether, yes.
45 altogether. All of these numbers, all of these millions and millions of smokers who quit, their quitting was driven primarily by people's fears about the dangers of smoking.
Right, that's the main reason for people quitting.
So to continue talking about this concept of quitting smoking, scientists would report in the media not only about the dangers of smoking, but also about studies regarding the reduced risk of lung cancer and other diseases from smoking cessation.
Yeah, they would advise people to quit and tell people why it was good for them.
That there were benefits associated with quitting smoking.
Yeah, well, the harm comes.
For example, in 1977, the United States Centers for Disease Control was reporting that 10 years after quitting, the lung cancer risk for former smokers approaches that of persons who had never smoked, right?
They said that, yes. They tended to exaggerate how great it would be just to quit.
Okay, but in 1977, the CDC was reporting that 10 years after quitting, your risk of developing lung cancer was approaching that of a never smoker.
I've seen this.
Objection, I guess the answer.
And newspapers picked up what the CDC was reporting about that 10-year reduction in risk,
They
right?
did. Newspapers picked it up.
Yeah, well, I just, yeah. I got it. Thank you. All right, I had to move that because we're going to look at the screen, so.
Okay.
All right. Mr. Morrison, can you please bring up PMU 2424? Mr. Baker?
Can we approach these?
I'm saying you're giving me one by one. I can give you all of them.
I guess it's like approach for a second.
Oh, sure. Well, Your Honor, would this be?
Please be seated, everyone. Ms. Schneider, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I think before the break, we were talking about how the media was publicizing studies that were being done about the health benefits of smoking, of quitting.
Right.
All right. So let's look at an article from the Miami Herald in 1977. And I want you to assume that the jury has heard that Mrs. Ledoux read this newspaper every night, okay?
Okay.
PMU 2424, Mr. Morrison. Thank you so much. This is from the Miami Herald from May 7th, 1977, as you can see.
Yes.
And it is titled, Smokers Can Regain Normal Life Expectancy. You see that?
I do.
And you've actually seen this article before.
I have.
The first paragraph of the article, if we could blow that up. Oh, no, that was instantaneous. If you stopped smoking cigarettes 10 years ago, your life expectancy rate equals that of persons who never smoked, the National Center for Disease Control said Friday. Correct?
That's what it says.
Now, if we go to the last paragraph of the article, that actually quotes from the report from the CDC and says, mortality rates from lung cancer are 10 times greater in smokers than in persons who have never smoked. Cessation of smoking reduces this differential gradually, so after 10 years, the mortality rate for these ex-smokers approaches that for persons who never smoked. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
2424. And there continue to be statements by governmental and public health authorities on the benefits of smoking cessation after this as well.
That's true.
Switching gears. You spent a lot of time with Mr. Page discussing the TIRC CTR, so I do have some questions for you about that.
Okay.
In the early 1950s, there was a call from the public health community that the tobacco industry create some sort of research organization, correct?
Yes, an honest research organization.
And as you discussed in the 1954 Frank Statement, the tobacco industry announced that they would create a research organization, correct?
Yes.
And that was called originally the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, or TIRC,
Correct.
and then it changed to the CTR in 1964.
That's right.
The Council for Tobacco Research, CTR, funded about $350 million in research.
That's right.
And as you pointed out at the last trial I was with you at in West Palm Beach, in today's dollars, it would be several times that amount, correct?
Yes.
And of course, this money that the TIRC and the CTR used to fund the research was money that had actually been provided by the tobacco companies.
Yes, entirely.
Because the TIRC and CTR did not have a way of generating income, what they were doing was granting awards to people who had applied for money to conduct research. I think you talked about that.
Yes.
The TIRC and CTR funded some excellent scientists.
Oh, yes. It's true.
And as you've told the jury, some of those went on to win the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, there are at least 10 CTR grantees who went on to win the Nobel Prize.
They funded excellent scientists at top universities in the country, right?
Yes.
Including Stanford, where you work,
Yes.
University of Florida,
Yes.
Florida State,
Right.
University of Miami,
Yes.
University of Alabama.
Yes.
TIRC or CTR funded 10 scientists, as you just said, who went on to win the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And there were a large number of publications generated related to the research funded by the special projects, right?
Well, yeah, the special projects is a subset of the CTR grants. Most of it went to the ordinary CTR grants, and that generated about over 7,000 publications.
And thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Proctor. 7,000 articles were published through funding from CTR.
Yes.
And these publications were published in highly respected, peer-reviewed journals.
That's true.
So I want to talk about some of those studies in a little more detail. The CTR did fund some epidemiological studies which found a very high increased risk of lung cancer among smokers as opposed to non-smokers.
Very few, a tiny handful.
Okay, but we're going to talk about some of them. You know who Dr. Herbert Lombard was?
Yes.
Dr. Lombard was a pioneering researcher on the relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right?
Yes. Already in the 1920s.
Right. In the 1920s, he conducted one of the earliest lung cancer and cigarette smoking studies.
Yes.
In 1965, a few decades later, CTR funded Dr. Lombard to do an epidemiological study that he published titled An Epidemiological Study in Lung Cancer, right?
Yes.
And in that publication, Dr. Lombard concluded that the increased risk of lung cancer in the cigarette smoker is clear.
Yeah, I think that's actually a quote.
There were also CTR-funded studies in the area of COPD.
A few, yes.
And the historical records indicate that a key advancement in our understanding of how the disease process works of COPD and its relationship to cigarette smoking were studies that showed a decline in lung function with age that was accelerated by cigarette smoking, right? And isn't it true that as we all age, our lung function decreases?
Yes.
But CTR funded studies that showed that the decline in lung function actually accelerated faster in smokers than in non-smokers.
Very few studies they did.
But there were some studies, right?
That's right.
And there were CTR-funded studies that found smokers had a diminished lung function compared to non-smokers.
That's right.
And hopefully I can say this right, but Dr. Bossy
Yes.
was another one of the early COPD researchers in the 1970s and 1980s.
That's right.
Dr. Bossy published CTR-funded studies over a period of 6 years that made findings on the relationship between cigarette smoking and the development of lung injury consistent with COPD, correct?
That's one of the things he was looking at.
Those findings by Bossy were actually directly contrary to statements the tobacco industry was making at the time.
That's true.
And the CTR-funded studies by Dr. Bossy helped advance the scientific knowledge on the relationship between cigarette smoking and COPD.
It did.
There were also studies done by Dr. Janoff concerning the relationship between cigarette smoking and COPD, right?
That's correct.
Did I pronounce that name
You did,
correctly?
yes.
Okay, you kind of give me an interesting look. Okay. Dr. Janoff published about a dozen studies between 1977 and 1983 that were funded by CTR.
Correct.
And you agree that the research that Dr. Janoff performed and that CTR helped fund was certainly relevant to smoking and health.
Yes, I do.
And you would agree that the research done by Dr. Janoff helped advance the state of scientific knowledge as to how cigarette smoking caused COPD, or another term, emphysema, in humans.
I do.
Now, you talked with Mr. Stern about a doctor named Dr. Alton Ochsner,
Yes.
who you said was a very well-known doctor from New Orleans, and who was one of the first to really observe the close connection of lung cancer and smoking.
He's one of the few to sound the alarm already in the 1930s.
And according to you, he's an important figure in increasing information about smoking and health.
Yes,
And there's an award named after him.
there is the Ochsner Award.
And that's related to research on smoking and health.
It is.
In fact, it's given for outstanding and exemplary original scientific investigations that relate to tobacco consumption and disease.
That's right.
So obviously then, human smoking and disease.
Yes,
And it's a very prestigious award.
it is.
In fact, you would like to win
I would
the
turn
award.
it down.
You'd be honored if you win.
Sure.
What did you say?
I was
You would actually consider it a Lifetime Achievement Award for your work on tobacco and history and smoking and health.
Well, the second, I think that's actually the name of the award is a Lifetime Achievement Award.
So then you would consider it a lifetime
Sure,
achievement
yes.
award. And Dr. Janoff, who we were talking about, who did research on COPD and smoking,
Yes.
was nominated for and actually won the Alton Ochsner Award for his research into links between cigarette smoking and COPD emphysema.
That's correct.
And that's work that we've been discussing. The CTR actually helped to fund.
That's right.
It's also true, sir, that the CTR funded studies about smoking and addiction.
Yes, occasionally.
And isn't it true that in 1963, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, the CTR predecessor, funded a study with tobacco company money that concluded cigarette smoking is addictive?
Yes.
And you're familiar with the publication that was published in peer-reviewed scientific literature by Dr. Knapp and his associates.
That's right, in the American Journal of Psychiatry.
All right, well, let's take a look at that article. Exhibit AIW 2649. This was an article titled Addictive Aspects in Heavy Cigarette Smoking by Peter Knapp, MD, and his research colleagues, right?
That's right, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
And this work was supported in part by grants from the American Cancer Society and the TIRC.
That's right.
So going to page 971, the conclusion of the paper was, and this is in 1963, heavy cigarette smokers thus appear to be true addicts, showing not only social habituation but mild physiological withdrawal effects, right? All right, let's go to some more additional work that Dr. Bossi did, who we had previously talked about. Dr. Bossi also did some CTR-funded work on smoking and nicotine addiction.
He did.
And in 1981, Dr. Bossi published a CTR-funded study that showed, quote, nicotine has been extensively and convincingly implicated as the addicting agent in tobacco.
Yes, I think that's an actual quote.
In this article, Dr. Bossi is basically stating that it's been proven that nicotine is the addicting agent in tobacco,
Yeah,
right?
that's his assumption.
In fact, that statement was made 7 years before the Surgeon General came out with his 1988 report that you looked at with Mr. Page.
That's right.
You also showed, near the end of your examination with Mr. Page, a document that had a phrase, God King.
Yes, from 1994.
And that document is a draft agenda for a committee of council meeting from February 9th, 1994.
That's right, preparing for the Waxman hearings.
Isn't it true, sir, that this document was only found in one place, the files of a secretary to a Philip Morris employee?
Yes, it's found in Philip Morris archives.
We've never seen a reference to the head of committee of council in any document in the files of RJR, VNW, ATC, or Lorillard referring to this term God King.
That's right, we only have one document that uses that term that I know of.
And there's no evidence that the head of the committee of council was actually referred to as God King by anybody other than this Philip Morris employee who wrote this draft document.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's the only document I know where the head of the committee of council is called the God King.
Let's go to a different topic. You agree, sir, that based upon your historical review of this issue, there is no such thing as a safe cigarette.
Yes, the only truly safe cigarette would be one you didn't smoke.
And you mentioned this briefly with Mr. Page, but I want to talk about a little bit more about inhalability and when inhalable tobacco smoke became available.
Yes.
All right. We talked about the effect that using flue-cured tobacco has on cigarettes being inhalable.
That's right, and Turkish as well.
All right, we're going to talk about that. So R.J. Reynolds and other manufacturers, including Brown and Williamson and Philip Morris, did not invent inhalable tobacco.
That's correct.
In fact, inhalable tobacco smoke almost certainly goes back thousands of years.
Probably. We don't really know the formulas for the very early tobaccos, but whoever had added sugar or used a lot of heat to cure the leaf could have generated tobacco that when you burned it would be inhaled.
And in fact, you would almost certainly say that the Native Americans invented inhalable tobacco because they were adding sugars to their tobacco, and as soon as they added the sugars, as you just mentioned, it becomes inhalable.
Yes, we don't know how common that was. We don't know if it was 1/10% or 10% of all the tobacco that was used. But I wouldn't be surprised if some had, and there are some ethnographic accounts that talk about Native Americans inhaling their smoke.
So let's talk about those. You're familiar with the Lewis and Clark expedition,
Yes.
and that was a very famous expedition where President Thomas Jefferson commissioned Lewis and Clark to lead an expedition from St. Charles, Missouri, across the entire American continent to the Pacific Ocean, right?
That's right, to find out if there were elephants in the Rockies.
Oh, I didn't know that. The Lewis and Clark expedition began in 1804.
Yes,
When Lewis and Clark made their expeditions, they would keep journals.
they did.
And one of the observations, as you mentioned, that you've seen in the journals is that they observed Native Americans inhaling tobacco and actually holding it in their lungs.
That's what they say.
Back in this time frame, the 1800s, in addition to Lewis and Clark, one of the things some people would do when they made treks across the country is to keep journals and record their observations.
They would.
And in those historic journals, you also saw references to Native Americans smoking tobacco, inhaling it, and holding it in their
I've
lungs.
seen a few references to that.
In addition to this continent, and I think you mentioned this earlier, we also know that inhalable tobacco was developed halfway around the world in the Middle East, Turkey, and the North Africa area.
Yes, because the leaves were often dried on the rooftops where you got a lot of sunshine. That sunshine also trapped the sugar in the leaf and made for a mild inhalable smoke.
The historical record reflects that by the 1700s, and probably before the 1700s, the people, as you just talked about, who lived in the Middle East and North Africa, developed inhalable tobacco through the means with which you just talked about.
Yes, some. Again, we don't know the proportion, but we know that some people did.
So, I think what you just talked about was called sun curing, right?
Yes, it's as opposed to flue curing using tubes or conduits for the fire. This is the heat trapped on the roofs of Mediterranean houses.
And sun curing was used to cure Turkish tobacco.
Yes,
Before flue cured tobacco was being used commonly in cigarettes, the primary form of tobacco that was used in cigarettes was called Turkish tobacco.
yes,
And in terms of their relative inhalability, Turkish tobacco is about the same as flue cured.
right, because they're both about 20% sugar by weight.
The historical record demonstrates that to the extent that a particular type of tobacco made cigarettes inhalable, it was the initial use of Turkish tobacco.
Probably, yes, though, as we've already mentioned, it could have been Native Americans, in which case that would not be Turkish tobacco.
The historical record demonstrates that the characteristic of a cigarette that makes it easily inhalable goes back to the 1830s in Turkey.
Yes, well, it's kind of simultaneous. I mean, you have it going on in Turkey, but also the 1830s is when flue curing is invented, so in that sense, they're kind of parallel developments.
And then a few decades later, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the most popular form of tobacco used in cigarettes in the United States would still have been the Turkish tobacco.
That's right.
In the 1860s, there were science writers writing about cigarettes, stating that cigarettes were inhalable, and that inhalability was what made them a uniquely dangerous product compared to other types of tobacco like pipes and cigars.
That's right.
And of course, this was over half a century before R.J. Reynolds had ever created the modern American cigarette.
The modern American cigarette of Reynolds dates only from 1913.
And Reynolds doesn't even start making cigarettes until 1912.
That's correct. They made chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco before that time.
And isn't it true, sir, that by the 1870s and 1880s, science writers were writing that virtually 90% of smokers who smoked on a regular basis were inhaling the smoke?
I've seen one example about that. I don't know about more than one.
But you've seen at least one example of that.
That's true.
Reynolds and Philip Morris did not invent flue curing.
No, it's invented already in the 1830s.
And because of that, they actually have nothing to do with flue curing.
Well, only in the sense that they are responsible for its enormous success later, but they didn't invent it.
Right.
But
Speaking,
they certainly had something to do,
and
just not originally.
And so, speaking just about the invention of flue curing, they had nothing to do with the invention of flue
That's
curing.
better said, yes.
Flue cured tobacco became popular before it was ever used in cigarettes, right?
That's true. Yeah, it was more often used for other purposes, and then, after all, there's not even that many cigarettes smoked in the 19th century.
From the time the leaf is picked in the field until it ends up in the cigarette, during the course of manufacturing, the amount of nicotine is typically reduced.
Yeah, though it's important to realize that depends a lot on how what you start with. So you can start with very high nicotine and it would be reduced. You can start with very low nicotine and it would be reduced. So the principles that govern how much nicotine go into it have a lot to do with the type of leaf you start with.
Typically speaking, though, when you're talking about a manufactured cigarette, in the course of manufacturing, the nicotine is typically reduced from the amount that's actually in the tobacco leaf.
That's true.
All right, turning to a different topic. The historical record demonstrates the tobacco companies tried to make a cigarette that was less hazardous.
Yes, that was really the whole point of the Battelle Hippo project, was to avoid what they called the unattractive side effects of cancer and cardiovascular disease.
And in fact, the tobacco industry spent what you described as a fortune trying to do that, making a cigarette that was less hazardous.
Yes.
You agree that R.J. Reynolds began in the 1950s trying to find ways to reduce the levels of those PAHs.
Yes.
And that type of experimentation began in the 1950s and continued all the way up to the 1980s and even beyond the 80s.
That's true.
Last topic. You talked with Mr. Stern about the decline in smoking prevalence in cigarette consumption, right?
Yes, that's right.
You believe the decline in smoking prevalence is evidence of the continued denormalization of cigarette smoking.
It is.
As you said, smoking prevalence is in rapid decline.
Yes, it's no longer as cool, glamorous, sexy to smoke.
And you anticipate that the prevalence of current cigarette smoking among adults in the United States will continue to decrease.
I do.
And as you said, the cigarette is really, quote, a horse and buggy technology
Yes.
that's on the decline and will continue to decline.
Yes, I think it's on its way out.
You think that we are in a period of collapse of cigarette smoking.
Yes, and I think it's 4 or 5 billion fewer cigarettes are smoked every year.
And you think that will continue.
I do. I think it will spiral down.
In fact, you think it's very likely that the number of cigarettes smoked per year in the United States will continue to decline essentially to zero.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Dr. Parker. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you.